So, we just finished talking about the carbon cycle and the role that soil plays in that cycle. But carbon is not the only element where soil plays a very important role in the biogeochemical cycles. Nitrogen is another element that is essential for living organisms. Carbon may be the scaffold for the big biological molecules, but nitrogen is also extremely important because it's a major component of protein and DNA molecules. That being the case, the flow of nitrogen between living and non living sources is another very important cycle in the environmental systems. And the good news is that nitrogen is an element, as an element, is extremely abundant. Nitrogen gas makes up almost 80% of the gas found in Earth's atmosphere. It is by far the most significant component of our atmosphere. The bad news is that this gaseous form of nitrogen is completely useless to most living organisms. Why is that the case? Well, as you can see in this figure showing the molecular structure of nitrogen gas, it is a covalent molecule. Remember that a covalent molecule is one where the atoms that make up that molecule are sharing electrons with each other. And in the case of molecular nitrogen, each atom in of nitrogen in the pair brings not one, not two, but three atoms to the table. So 6 electrons are shared altogether, three from each nitrogen. So these nitrogen atoms are very deeply invested in the covalent bond that they share with each other. And that makes this bond very strong and the molecule itself very stable. It is very, very difficult to crack this molecule open and get to the atoms of nitrogen so that they could be incorporated into other biological molecules. Almost no living organism can do that. But the ones that can are soil bacteria. Some aquatic bacteria can do this as well, but we're given special attention to the soil dwelling varieties in this chapter because of the interplay they have with agriculture. Collectively, these bacteria are called diazotrophs. And on the slide is one example of a species called Azospirillum. So, azospirillum and other diazotrophs can perform what's called nitrogen fixation, the process of capturing gaseous molecular nitrogen out of the atmosphere and transforming it into a different molecule called ammonia, NH3. You may remember that we defined carbon fixation as the process of photoautotrophs capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and incorporating it into biological molecules. And the same principle exists with nitrogen fixation. And converting molecular nitrogen into ammonia is key because ammonia is a form of nitrogen that organisms, namely plants, can incorporate into biological molecules. So these nitrogen fixing bacteria will make nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and turn it into a form available to plants in the form of ammonia. Then plants can absorb ammonia from the soil and use it to build some of their most important biological molecules, DNA and proteins. This step, where uh, excuse me, this step takes ammonia and it's called ammonium assimilation. Eventually, these plants are going to die, and the organisms that ate those plants are going to die. And so, there's also a step that completes the cycle where decomposers in the soil take organic material, that DNA, those proteins, after an organism dies, and breaks it all the way back down into ammonia. And this step is called ammonification. So now we have this neat loop of ammonium assimilation to ammonification. So it's a nice, neat, clean loop. But there's actually another layer of complexity because this ammonia here is not only in demand by plants, but also by certain types of soil bacteria called nitrifying bacteria. And nitrifying bacteria don't want the ammonia for its nitrogen, but rather for its electrons. Nitrifying bacteria can actually use ammonia as an energy source. They can oxidize it to extract its electrons, much like heterotrophs do with carbohydrates, such as glucose, when they perform cellular respiration. This process is called nitrification, and the result is that the ammonia is transformed into an ion called nitrate, or NO3, with a negative electric charge. This form of nitrogen, the nitrate ion, is also agreeable for plant absorption. So, in addition to getting some nitrogen from ammonia via ammonium assimilation, plants will take up the nitrate ion, which is a waste product that the nitrifying bacteria spit out. And they will use it as a source of nitrogen to build important organic molecules like DNA and proteins. This process is called assimilatory nitrate reduction because the nitrogen gets assimilated at the same time that it is being reduced. Or, in other words, electrons get added to the molecule and it gets built into something bigger. There's one final leg of this cycle that we need to talk about, and that has to do with the fact that, once again, the nitrate here is in demand not only by plants, but also soil bacteria under certain conditions. Do you remember back in chapter 2 when we talked about alternative processes to cellular respiration? We had talked about the fact that cellular respiration requires oxygen to extract the energy from organic molecules like carbohydrates. And when oxygen is not available, there are these two other processes that heterotrophs turn to: anaerobic respiration and fermentation, as you see on the top and the bottom, to break down molecules which will perform the exact same function as oxygen in the process. And the common oxygen substitute is nitrate. So, getting back to the nitrogen cycle, it's not just plants that want this nitrate as a source of nitrogen for their biological molecules. Under oxygen depleted conditions, bacteria want it as well because it allows them to run anaerobic respiration and continue to extract energy from carbohydrates. This process, whereby bacteria use the nitrate as an oxygen substitute, is called denitrification, and it leads to the transformation of the nitrate back into molecular nitrogen, or nitrogen gas, which gets released into the atmosphere. While this does complete the nitrogen cycle, the denitrification step is considered a challenge for agriculture, because what farmers really want to happen is that nitrate is not that it gets consumed by denitrifying bacteria. They and turn back into useless nitrogen gas form. What they want is for as much nitrate as possible to be channeled into assimilatory nitrate reduction, where it gets taken up by the crop plants. As such, keeping soils well aerated is a great way to prevent denitrification from happening, because bacteria will only need to use the nitrate as a backup if oxygen is not available. Waterlogged soil has a big problem with denitrification because the lack of air circulation in the soil means that microbes will start using the nitrate, which limits its availability to plants. So that was a lot of information. And so a summary and a recap is warranted to try to tie this all together. Nitrogen is an extremely important element for living things. And although its molecular form, and two, um, which you see at the bottom of this figure, although it is extremely prevalent in the atmosphere, it's also almost useless amongst all living organisms in this form. Only certain types of bacteria can perform nitrogen fixation, which turns that nitrogen into the more useful form of ammonia. Plants can take that up from the soil through a process called ammonium assimilation and use it in their biomolecules. When organisms die, Decomposers will reverse that process, break down the molecules back down, and release their nitrogen in the form of ammonia. And that's called ammonification. But it's not just plants that use ammonia. Other types of soil bacteria can perform nitrification as an energy generating process for their cells, which turns the ammonia into nitrate. And then plants can take up that nitrate in a process called assimilatory nitrate reduction and use it to create their biomolecules as well. However, plants have to compete with soil bacteria for the nitrate under oxygen depleted conditions. But it can also be used as a substitute for oxygen in anaerobic respiration. And this leads to denitrification and the conversion of nitrate back into nitrogen gas. So now we understand how nitrogen naturally cycles through the biosphere and way that soil bacteria serve as the gateway for nitrogen to become accessible to other organisms. And after hearing how prevalent a role soil bacteria play in the carbon cycle in the last section, you might come away with the impression that there's plenty of nitrogen to go around from these soil bacteria. However, just the opposite is true. In many ecosystems, nitrogen is the primary limiting nutrient, meaning that plants have enough of everything else to extend their growth, but lack of nitrogen is holding them back. Because of this, application of nitrogen fertilizers has become an extremely prevalent farming practice. And you can see here how the amount of nitrogen fertilizer used per hectare of cropland has increased substantially in many major agricultural regions across the globe over the past 60 years. Industrial nitrogen production accounts for half of all nitrogen fixed in the biosphere now. Humans are performing roughly as much nitrogen fixation as all of the bacteria in the world combined and using that for fertilizer. And if these increases in nitrogen fertilizer were leading to higher agricultural productivity, that would be one thing, but the fertilizer is being used very inefficiently. More than half of it leaches into underground aquifers, washes off into streams and rivers, and ends up in the ocean. In India, that figure is 70%, and in China, that figure is 75%. When this nitrogen runs off into bodies of water, it can fuel massive explosions in planktonic population, where the plankton grow so quickly they actually consume all of the oxygen dissolved in the water and suffocate the other aquatic life. And this is what's called hypoxia, also known as a dead zone. In the photo on the left, you can see one such plankton bloom in the Baltic Sea in 2005. And on the right is a map. You can see a red dot placed on many of the ocean's coastal dead zones. The other problem with nitrogen fertilizers is their energy intensiveness. In the early 1900s, a chemical manufacturing process, now known as the Haber-Bosch process, was developed to synthetically transform gaseous molecular nitrogen into ammonia. Bacteria do it biologically with enzymes, but humans have the technology now to do it as well. The problem with this process is that it is extremely energy intensive. Molecular nitrogen is so stable that to break it apart requires the machinery to operate at 572 to 932 degrees Fahrenheit and at a pressure that is 25 to 35 times greater than normal atmospheric pressure. Keeping these high temperatures and pressures requires truly an absurd amount of energy. The Haber-Bosch process consumes a full 1% of the world's total energy production and is responsible for 1.4% of carbon dioxide emissions, which may not sound like a lot, but when you're talking about all of the energy in the world, 1% to this single process, that truly is an unbelievable amount of energy being used and fossil fuels being burned to drive this process. So, the excessive global use of nitrogen fertilizers is contributing to environmental crisis, both in terms of the waterborne pollution it generates and the energy investment it requires.